The day my son received his acceptance letter to the University of Toronto Faculty of Medicine, I was standing in the break room of St. Michael's Hospital, still wearing my nursing scrubs from a 12-hour shift. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the phone. He had called me at 6:47 the morning, his voice breaking in a way I hadn't heard since he was 7 years old and had fallen off his bicycle on our street in Scarborough. "Mum," he said. "Mum," I got in. I pressed my back against the cold wall and slid down until I was sitting on the floor. A colleague walked in, saw me, and quietly walked back out. I didn't cry. I had cried enough in the 18 years before that moment. That morning, I just sat on that floor and breathed. What I didn't know, what I couldn't have known while sitting on that break room floor, was that the man responsible for destroying my family was already in my son's life. That his son was already my son's closest friend. That in 4 years, at a university convocation ceremony inside Convocation Hall, that man would stand up in front of 200 people, look me in the eye, and say the words that would change everything. But I'm getting ahead of myself. My name is Margaret. I was born and raised in Scarborough, Ontario, the daughter of a factory worker and a woman who cleaned offices downtown before the city woke up. I married my husband, Dennis, when I was 26. He was a structural inspector for a construction firm, a careful, steady man who believed in doing things right the first time. We bought a small semi-detached on a quiet street in East York. We had our son, Daniel, in the spring of 1998. Life was not glamorous, but it was ours. In the summer of 2003, Dennis was sent to inspect a residential construction site in the north end of the city. The project was run by a development company called Harwick Properties. The site supervisor, a man I will call by his last name only Garfield, had been cutting corners for months. Inspectors had flagged concerns. Reports had been filed. Nothing had been done because Harwick Properties had friends in the right offices and enough money to keep problems quiet. Dennis found the issue on a Tuesday afternoon. A load-bearing scaffold had been assembled incorrectly. He documented it, photographed it, and filed an urgent report. He called me that evening and told me he thought the site might be shut down by morning. The scaffold collapsed on Wednesday. Dennis survived the fall. 3 other workers did not. He spent 6 weeks in St. Michael's Hospital, the same hospital where I would later work for 20 years with a spinal injury that ended his career and, over the following 3 years, quietly ended him. He never recovered fully, not physically, not anywhere else. He passed away in January of 2007. Daniel was 8 years old. He had just learned to skate. The investigation afterward was long and, ultimately, hollow. Garfield and Harwick Properties were fined. The fine was the kind that a company that size pays the way most people pay for a parking ticket. No one went to prison. The families of the 3 men who died received settlements with non-disclosure agreements attached. We received nothing except the knowledge that my husband had done the right thing and that it had not mattered. I kept everything. Every report Dennis had filed. Every photograph. The inspector's notes. The internal communications that a colleague of Dennis's had quietly passed to me 6 months after the inquest closed at a Tim Hortons on Danforth Avenue. In an envelope he slid across the table without making eye contact. He told me he was sorry. He told me he hoped one day it would count for something. I put everything in a manila envelope and placed it in the back of my filing cabinet, behind Daniel's school records and our house insurance documents. And then I went back to work. I put myself through nursing school while Daniel was in primary school. My mother took him on the mornings I had early classes. I worked every shift the hospital offered. I learned to be efficient with money in the way that people who have very little of it learn to be grocery sales, second-hand winter coats, a thermostat that went no higher than 19 degrees from October through April. Daniel never complained. He was a serious, quiet child who did his homework without being asked and who, at the age of 12, told me he wanted to be a doctor. I told him we'd figure it out. I believed it. He earned an entrance scholarship to University of Toronto. He took on a part-time job. I worked overtime every month during his undergraduate years. We figured it out. When he got into medical school, I called my mother and then I sat on the floor of the hospital break room, and that was the extent of my celebration. Daniel was in his 2nd year of medical school when he started mentioning a friend. His name was Connor. They had met during a study group. Daniel said he was sharp, focused, good company. I was glad. My son had always been a little solitary, and I had always worried quietly about that. I asked the usual questions. Where was Connor from? North York. What did his family do? His father was in real estate development. I did not make the connection immediately. Why would I? Toronto is a large city. Real estate development is not a small industry. I made the connection 8 months later, when Daniel brought Connor home for the first time, and Connor mentioned, casually, that his father's company had recently completed a project in Vaughan. He mentioned the company name, Harwick Properties. I set down my tea mug very carefully. I asked Connor his last name. He said it, Garfield. I excused myself to the kitchen for a moment. I stood at the sink and looked out at the backyard where Daniel had played as a boy, and I thought, very clearly, not yet. Not yet. I did not tell Daniel. I have asked myself 1,000 times whether that was the right decision, and I am still not sure. What I knew was this. My son had 3 years of medical school ahead of him. He was happy. He was focused. He had a good friend. I had no proof that Connor was anything other than what he appeared to be, a decent young man who happened to share his father's last name. I had lived long enough to know that children are not their parents. I decided I would wait. I would watch. I kept the envelope where it was. Connor and Daniel graduated together in the spring. I was in 2 seats in Convocation Hall. I brought my mother, who was 81 and who had not been inside a university building since she had attended my nursing pinning ceremony 30 years earlier. She wore her good coat. I wore a dark blue dress I had bought at a consignment shop on Queen Street and had taken in at the waist myself. The Garfield family had a full row. I saw him for the first time in person when I came in, Connor's father. He was a large man, well-dressed, the kind of person who takes up space in a room by habit rather than intention. His wife sat beside him. They had other children with them, and what appeared to be colleagues or family friends, people who laughed easily and carried themselves the way people do when they have never had to think very carefully about money. He did not notice me. Why would he? I was a woman in a dark blue dress sitting 2 sections away. The ceremony was everything I had imagined. When Daniel's name was called and he walked across that stage in his gown, my mother gripped my arm so hard I had a bruise for a week afterward. I did not mind. I had made a quiet promise to Dennis a long time ago, standing in his hospital room, that I would get our son there. I had kept it. The reception afterward was held in the atrium. Wine was served, small sandwiches on trays. The kind of event where people speak loudly and no one quite hears anyone else. My mother and I found Daniel near the windows. He was standing with Connor. Connor introduced us to his father. It is a strange thing to shake hands with a person you have thought about for 17 years. Garfield shook my hand. He looked at me the way some men look at women my age through us, really, cataloging us quickly and finding nothing worth more attention. He asked what I did. I told him I was a nurse at St. Michael's. He nodded. He said something to his own wife. He moved on. He had been talking to another family for perhaps 10 minutes when he came back. Daniel and Connor had stepped away. My mother was speaking with Connor's mother. I was standing alone. Garfield looked at me and said, loudly enough for the people immediately around us to hear, "You must be so relieved, must be a weight off, having the boy finally earning a real salary." He laughed, a short sound. Single mum, nursing, I imagine these last few years were a stretch. The room did not go quiet. It was too loud for that, but the people near us heard. A couple turned. A woman I didn't know looked at me with an expression. I recognized the expression of someone who has just witnessed something small and cruel and public. I looked at Garfield. I thought about Dennis on that scaffold. I thought about the envelope in my filing cabinet. I thought about the Tim Hortons on Danforth Avenue and the man who had slid a package across a table without making eye contact, and the words he had said, "I hope one day it will count for something." I smiled. "Actually," I said, "it has been a stretch. But not for the reasons you might think. I had not come to the convocation planning to do anything. I want to be honest about that. The envelope had been in my filing cabinet for 17 years. I had not taken it out with any intention. But 3 weeks before the ceremony, I had received a phone call from a journalist at the Toronto Star who had been investigating Harwick Properties in connection with a new development in Etobicoke where workers were raising safety concerns. She had found Dennis's name in the original inquest records. She had found my number. We had spoken for 2 hours. I had asked her to give me until after the convocation. I had asked her to hold the story for 3 more weeks. She had agreed. I looked at Garfield and I said, "I've been a nurse at St. Michael's for 20 years. I worked there when my husband was a patient, after the scaffold collapse at your Finch Avenue site in 2003. I don't know if you remember, Dennis, but I remember you." He went very still. The woman next to us had stopped pretending not to listen. "I kept every report my husband filed before the collapse," I said. "Every photograph. I also have the internal communications your site supervisor sent to the project manager 3 weeks before the accident, which indicated that the scaffold issue had been flagged and that the decision was made to proceed regardless. I gave copies to a journalist at the Star last month. I believe the story is running in the next few weeks." His face had changed. It had become the face of a man running calculations. "I'm not telling you this to threaten you," I said. "The journalist already has everything. I'm telling you because I think you should know that the woman you just felt comfortable pitying in front of her son's colleagues is the wife of one of the men your negligence killed, and I thought you deserved to know that before you read it in the paper." I picked up my wine glass. I walked back toward my mother. My mother, who had heard none of this from where she was standing, looked at my face and said, "What happened?" "Nothing bad," I said. "Daniel found out that evening. He came to my house after the reception, still in his dress shirt, and he sat at my kitchen table the way he used to sit when he was a teenager working through a problem. I told him everything about the collapse, about the documents, about Connor's father, about the journalist. I told him I had known about the connection since second year and that I had said nothing because I had not believed it was my right to make that decision for him. He was quiet for a very long time. Then he said, "Why didn't you tell me, Mum?" And I said, "Because you needed to finish what you started, and because Connor is not his father." He sat with that for a while. Then he asked if I had eaten dinner. I told him I hadn't. He got up and made us both eggs and toast, the way he had done on Sunday mornings since he was 12 years old, standing on a step stool at the stove because he wasn't quite tall enough to reach it comfortably yet. He put a plate in front of me and he sat down and we ate together in the quiet kitchen, and outside the window the city was doing what it always does, moving on, not waiting. The story ran in the Toronto Star on a Thursday morning in late June. It was not just about the 2003 collapse. The journalist had found 2 additional sites, both within the previous 5 years, both with documented safety violations, both with evidence suggesting the issues had been known and buried. The story was thorough and carefully sourced. It named Garfield by name. By Friday afternoon, the Ontario government had announced a formal review of Harwick Properties' active permits. I read the story on my phone during a break at the hospital, standing in the same break room where I had slid down the wall 18 years before. I sent the journalist a short message thanking her. I called my mother. I went back to work. Connor called Daniel. They spoke for a long time, I was told. Connor had not known about the 2003 site. He was 28 years old. He had been a child when it happened. Daniel told me afterward that Connor had cried, that he had said he was sorry, that he knew that wasn't enough. Daniel told him he was right, that it wasn't enough, and that he understood anyway, and that he needed some time. They found their way back to each other. It took several months. I think it will take more time still, and I think that is appropriate. Some things should take time. I think about Dennis often. I think about him most in winter, when the city gets the particular gray quality it has in January and February, that flat Canadian cold that presses down on everything. He loved winter. He loved skating with Daniel on the outdoor rink at Greenwood Park, loved the smell of a Tim Hortons on a cold morning, loved the way the city looked under the first snow before anyone had walked through it. He was a good man who did the right thing and was not protected for it, and I spent a long time being very angry about that, and I spent a long time being afraid that the anger was all I had left. It wasn't, though. That's the thing I couldn't have told you at 27, standing in a hospital corridor. You grieve, and you work, and you raise your child, and somewhere along the way the grief stops being the whole story. It becomes part of the story. It becomes the thing that made you careful and serious and honest. It becomes the thing that made you keep the envelope. It becomes the reason you were standing in that atrium when it finally mattered. Daniel finished his residency at Toronto General. He is doing what he set out to do. He calls me on Sunday evenings. He still makes eggs when he comes for dinner. I retired from Street Michaels last autumn. 23 years. My colleagues gave me a card and a plant and a cake with a nurse's hat on it made of icing. I brought the plant home and put it on the kitchen windowsill where it gets the afternoon light. I water it every Thursday. I still have the envelope. I don't know why, exactly. The journalist has copies of everything. The review is ongoing. The documents have done what they were meant to do. But I find I'm not ready to throw it away yet. Maybe I never will be. Maybe it's enough to know it's there, the record of a careful man who photographed the thing that was wrong and filed the report and trusted that someone would act on it. Someone eventually did. It just took a little longer than it should have.